Yes, good morning. Thank you for having me here and inviting me to speak in my native tongue, and to Angel and Carlos Flasco and the other partners. It is my first time here, and that was one of my big educational gaps, and it will not be my last time here. I can assure you, it's a pleasure and an honor. It is hard to get away from Washington, D.C. These days because we're all so very busy making America great again that I'm glad I could be here with you this morning. I think that how can I help you help me help us? We're in a moment where none of us have a shortage of information. So I don't come bearing information. You have enough information. And I think we're in a moment where we collectively have no shortage of intelligence or IQ points, right? We have brains, and they're big, and they're with us, and they're here in this room. So I can't do anything there. But I'm going to try, in my humble way, to give you a way in which we might think about what's happening in the United States and how it affects our partners and you. And two things as preface. One, I have a friend who is a British scientist. He's a psychiatrist, and he's an expert in neuroscience. He studies the brain. And he researches how the two hemispheres of the brain work together, the left and the right. It's not a new subject, but he dives deeper and researches more and concludes broadly, both biologically, but also, if you will, philosophically and metaphorically, that both hemispheres of the brain have a purpose and we need both together. He says the left hemisphere of the brain is that part that allows us to focus on detail, on threats, on the specific and the short term, and we can't live without it. He says, however, also the right hemisphere of the brain allows us to have peripheral vision and to see farther and to take the detail and put it into context and make meaning out of it, or sense, or purpose. That's the first point as preface. The second, I was quite taken by an article I read not so long ago about a Harvard art historian. We're here to talk about politics and economics. We're coming to that. A Harvard art historian named Jennifer Roberts. Every semester, she gives her students the following assignment. She says to them, pick a painting, any painting. Pick a painting, and then go to the museum and sit with a notebook, and none of this, no tweeting, no emails, no texting, okay, with a notebook, and ready, the students are in horror at first. They rebel. They despise, they hate. She says, and sit quietly with the painting for 3 hours. Yeah, 3 hours, you know. And they all do it, and they all have the same experience. First, frustration, fidgeting. What am I doing? Why am I being punished? Is the feeling of the students. But the point of the exercise, and they all conclude, is that seeing things is not instantaneous. And when they spend time with the painting of their choice, and they get over the first 15 or 20 or 30 minutes of frustration and anger, they see things they didn't see before. They see colors they didn't see before. They see relationships between objects that they didn't see before. They see lines and texture and dimension and order that they didn't see before. And why do I tell you that? I think that's the big challenge now for all of us, where we have so much information and the speed of technology and the speed of economics and the speed of politics, and trying to figure out the order of it and the larger meaning of it and the priorities in it. And I think it's a very difficult exercise. I think it's difficult because each and every one of us comes from a personal perspective. None of us have a full and complete data set. And I think in each and every case, and my case too, we all as human beings have blind spots. There's something that we don't quite see or don't quite comprehend. So in that context, I'm going to share two key thoughts with you in that context. The first thought is, before we talk about Donald J. Trump, the new President of the United States, and what he will do, because we all want to know what now, what next, practically, in politics and politics, I think it's first useful to talk a little bit about why Donald Trump. Where did this come from? It has roots somewhere. He didn't come out of thin air. It didn't happen miraculously, suddenly, for no reason at all. I think there are a number of reasons for it. You remember the attributed quotation decades ago to a British prime minister named Harold Macmillan, who, when asked, what should politicians fear most? He said, events, dear boy, events. Well, I'm going to augment that by saying it's the confluence of events. It's the combination of events that we should probably fear most. In the United States of America, we have a strange sort of paradox. Because on the one hand, if you look at certain factors, we're kind of doing okay. I looked up the other day, the United States, since the Second World War, has had 10 or 11 recessions. This is not one. The economy is growing. Not robustly, not fabulously, but the economy is growing. Unemployment, 4.5, 4.8, 4.9%. It's not a calamity. It's not a catastrophe. Inflation is under control. You read a lot and watch a lot on television about inner cities and race relations. It's important. We have problems. And as President Obama says, never been better before. Compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, if you look at tolerance levels, integration in society of African Americans, interracial dating, interracial marriage, it's all better. But it's not the feeling in the country right now. It's not the smell. It's not the perception. The feeling, the mood in important parts of the country is anxiety, turmoil, even crisis. Okay? So why this? I'll mention a half a dozen things. I think together over lunch or in the conversation ensuing, we could think of more things. I'll mention a half a dozen things I noted today. Number one, the feeling in the United States that income inequality is growing to levels that are not tolerable. Okay? Capitalism or free enterprise always has income inequality. What level is intolerable? Well, it's not a scientific thing you can establish, but it's a public mood, it's a public perception, and when CEOs of companies make large sums, I read of one the other day who got a severance package in the United States of $400 million, and then other parts of the society feel left out or left behind. That's a source of political friction. Number two, the idea in the United States that we have now disintegrating or maybe even collapsing social mobility. The whole idea of democratic capitalism or market democracy is that it's based on merit, and no matter who I am, if I work hard, at least in theory, I have the opportunity of moving up. that perception in the United States is changing. Number three, the stress, or if you wish, Carlos, you mentioned this, the crush of globalization and technology, where one part of the society goes faster and smoother and more effectively, but other parts struggle to keep up because education becomes even more important and access to technology becomes even more important for success. Number four, the rise of special interests, where there's a feeling that the special interest groups do not represent society as a whole, and they become increasingly powerful. Number five, the rise in my country of what we call identity politics and political correctness, okay? So in a moment like this, President Obama, in the summer, before an election, decided to sue the state of North Carolina over the issue of transgender bathroom use, okay? Wherever you are on those issues, and I'm the first to say we have to have a society that's tolerant, open-minded, sensitive, and inclusive, where most Americans are right now, what they're feeling, where they're hurting, is not about transgender bathroom use. It's not the top 3 priorities. It's not the top 5 priorities. I bet you it's not the top 10 priorities. And last but not least, growing debt, okay? That has an economic dimension and I think a moral dimension to it as well. What this means for us, I think broadly, is these are the underpinnings of liberal democracy and free enterprise. And for Americans, U.S. Americans, these are the underpinnings of the, the so-called American dream. The idea that people can come from abroad, they can start from where we are, and it's a meritocracy, it's transparent, there's equality of opportunity, and a general fairness that permeates the economic, social, and political life. I think those things in the United States have been eroding in the minds of many Americans, and I think there's reason for them to be concerned. Let me add 2 more things to that. One has to do with foreign policy, and in my shorthand, it hurt us and helped the rise of someone like Donald Trump that President George W. Bush was guilty of a kind of overreach in Iraq, notably centrally, and President Obama for 8 years has been guilty of a kind of underreach as a reaction. We don't matter that much. Liberal world order is kind of a fancy think tank title, and so we withdraw and we retreat and we let others do more. Well, that's nice on a chalkboard, but as we know, history abhors vacuums, and vacuums get filled. They're being filled by Russia, populists, Iran, ISIS, China, all in different ways, very different ways, but not all to the good of what we would call a free, democratic-friendly, liberal trading order. The other thing that is very specific to the United States is we have had an erosion, I would say even decay, of popular and political culture in the United States. Sorry for being so specific, but for 20 years now, we have had the advent and proliferation of what we call conservative talk radio. Those of you who know the United States know this very well. It's coarse, it's rabid, it's angry, it traffics in some fringe conspiracy theories. Obama wasn't born in the United States, he's illegitimate, and so on and so forth. It's leaked across the popular culture. Look at reality television, which is not all bad, and I don't mean to sound conservative or fussy about it, but some of it is really quite crude and really quite unsophisticated and really quite base. I said to someone at dinner last night, a month ago, I turned on at 8 o'clock, switched through to find some television program, and I see a reality television show, and here's what I see. In a restaurant, a man taking a drink and throwing it in the woman's face, his wife, his girlfriend, his sister maybe, violently. And then they cut away and they're at home. She goes into the bathroom. He kicks the door down. She kicks him. He kicks her. Funny? Entertaining? Good ratings and audience size? I'm not for censorship. I'm not for censorship. But there's lots of that. And now we see it leaks into the political culture. And who arrives? Donald J. Trump. And what is he? He's vulgar. He's angry. He wants quick fixes now to complex problems without hardly any attention to the unintended consequences, okay? Why do I say all that? He's a product of something. He came from somewhere. And so to conclude my first of 2 points, if Donald Trump vanished to Mars today, all the underlying problems are still there. All the underlying causes and roots are still there. Donald Trump may be a problem, some of you told me last night, but the roots are what we have to deal with. He will come and he will go, but the roots will still be there. Which brings me to the second point. Of course, everybody wants to know, what will he do? And so now I have to disappoint you a little bit because I haven't the foggiest idea. You know, the man has never held elected office, so that doesn't help us. He's never been a mayor. He's never been a dog catcher. So we don't have much evidence, you know, what he will do. We have many, many, many tweets. You know, he's a very good Twitter account manager, but tweets are not policy. Okay, so he's inaugurated on Friday, and we're going to see. Some people think that he is not at all ideological. He's opportunistic, as many populists are, and that's a good thing, okay? I think that's partially true, that he's not ideological and that he's opportunistic around power. But I don't think it's completely true, and I'll tell you why. I went back recently to 1987 to look at the ads that Donald Trump bought in the New York Times and other magazines, newspapers in the United States, 1987, 30 years ago. And boy, oh boy, 30 years ago, he was protectionist. He was very hard on allies. He said it was time for America to end, as he put it, our world protection. He said allies should pay for their own freedom, and he was isolationist. Today, he may say things like Ukraine don't matter to the United States. In 1987, he said the Persian Gulf is of marginal significance to the United States. Protectionist, isolationist, and a very simplistic zero-sum view of world affairs. So opportunist, maybe not deeply ideological, but I think in his veins pulses some things that in a country like Chile, and in, I dare say, a room like this, for those who are liberal-minded, outward-looking, trade-oriented, I don't think it's particularly good news. About your part of the world, I'll let others speak. I can't tell you too much because I've heard Donald Trump on Mexico and I've heard Donald Trump on Cuba. I've not heard him on Latin America and South America otherwise. I've not heard him on Chile or Argentina or Brazil, and I have the concern that maybe even Mexico and Cuba are kind of props in a theater or a television show. I don't know what his enduring interests and concerns about Mexico and Cuba are. But I'll conclude with this. I think we're going to know a lot in 6 months, and I think we're going to know everything we need to know in 18 months about one of three things that are likely to happen. Okay? The first thing, which I do hope for, is that the office of President of the United States, the responsibility of being President of the United States, along with a infrastructure of checks and balances and media and Congress and courts and partners, international partners who, like you, speak and have interests and have opinions, will moderate him. And he will, as president, not be exactly the same impulsive, rabid character he was as candidate. I think that's possible, okay? And I think that's hope. I think, second, we will learn in 6 to 18 months, however, whether this doesn't happen, and he'll be impeached. That sounds crazy. I mean, he hasn't been inaugurated yet, and Jeff Gedmin is talking about the impeachment of a new president, but I'm not certain about his commitment to rule of law. Note how he treats media, notes how he treats independent judiciary and courts, and as you well know, his conflicts of interest are vast, are really vast. And we will hear about them every single week in the New York Times and the Washington Post and through lawsuits and litigation. So I don't exclude the possibility that he doesn't last 4 years. And then the third, of course, is the hardest at all, that the mediating institutions and political environment and partners like you do not moderate or change him. And with his fierce tenacity, he is tenacious, he is a fighter, he stays in office, and we will have 4 really bruising and maybe bloody years. That sounds stark, but I think bruising and maybe bloody years. Where does that leave us? I think that passivity is the worst thing that you and I and we could think about. I think this goes beyond normal partisan politics, in part because of what happens in our country, in part because of the manifestation through Donald Trump, but in part what's happening in the world, as you well know, and the global phenomenon of rising populism or rising authoritarian populism. I think that we have to work very hard to figure out how to fix the problems of today, connect to populations that feel this level of discontent, and fight what we know to be illiberal and fundamentally at odds with democratic and market values. Final thought. No one can predict the future. I can't predict the future. I'm just going to tell you, boy, oh boy, we better stretch our imagination. We really ought to stretch our imagination, okay? And I think, you know, I'm an American, so we're pathological optimists. That's how we're wired. You call us naive. We say we're optimistic. But you know, if I had sat here 8, 9, 10 years ago before you, imagine, that's short, 8, 9, 10 years ago, and I had said to you, you know what? Russia will invade and occupy Georgia and Ukraine. Turkey will turn solidly authoritarian and openly hostile to Europe, the EU, and European values. You know what? There'll be 4 failed states in the Middle East: Syria, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, and guess what? Donald Trump will be president of the United States. You would have laughed and laughed and laughed. You said, don't you ever invite him again. How can you invite? He's on drugs. He's on drugs. So, can these problems be managed? Well, of course, they can one by one, but I think we should be incredibly humble with wide open imagination that what we've experienced these last 10 years, if we get on a wrong path, it could be profoundly bad, but really seriously a world crisis. With that, charming and cheerful note, thank you very much.